For centuries, victims of abuse have been handed a devastatingly misunderstood piece of advice: just turn the other cheek. It has been preached from pulpits as a mandate for silent suffering, a divine command to simply endure cruelty. But what if we've had it entirely wrong? What if this ancient biblical command wasn't about passive submission at all, but was actually a highly sophisticated psychological weapon designed to break a trauma bond? Today, we are dismantling one of the most dangerous misconceptions in modern theology. We are going to look at the Christian command of non-retaliation not as a spiritual burden, but as a clinical, neurological intervention. To understand why turning the cheek is a psychological weapon, you first have to understand the battlefield of a trauma-bonded brain. A trauma bond doesn't happen because a victim is weak, foolish, or lacking in faith. It happens because the human nervous system is highly susceptible to chemical manipulation. When you are trapped in a toxic or abusive dynamic, your brain is forced onto a violent, involuntary neurochemical roller coaster. During periods of conflict, aggression, or psychological manipulation, your brain floods your entire system with cortisol and adrenaline. Your amygdala, the brain's primitive threat detection center, flashes red, screaming that you are in mortal danger and thrusting you into a state of hypervigilant survival. But abusers rarely stay in a state of constant, overt aggression. If they did, the survival instinct would eventually force you to flee. Instead, the abuse is punctuated by moments of intense, manufactured affection, tearful apologies, or sudden periods of eerie calm. This is the honeymoon phase, and neurologically speaking, it is the ultimate trap. When the abuser suddenly validates you, expresses remorse, or acts with unexpected kindness, your brain's reward center lights up bright green. It releases a massive wave of dopamine and oxytocin, the bonding hormone responsible for deep human attachment. This sudden, jarring shift from profound terror to profound relief creates an intoxicating chemical cocktail. Your brain literally becomes addicted to the cycle. You begin to crave the abuser's validation because they have successfully positioned themselves as the only source of relief from the very pain they are causing. It is the psychological equivalent of a behavioral slot machine. The victim keeps enduring the losses, desperate for that rare, unpredictable jackpot of affection and safety. Over time, this intermittent reinforcement breeds a psychological condition known as learned helplessness. The victim's brain learns that fighting back or trying to escape only leads to more aggression and more cortisol. Conversely, submitting, fawning, and waiting for the apology brings the desperately needed dopamine hit. The trauma bond is fully solidified when the victim's nervous system becomes entirely tethered to the erratic whims of the abuser. The brain has been hijacked, prioritizing immediate chemical relief over long-term safety and autonomy. This brings us to the massive, deeply uncomfortable elephant in the pews. For victims trapped in this agonizing neurochemical loop, the traditional, surface-level interpretation of Matthew 5:39 feels like a death sentence. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other also. How many abusers have weaponized this exact verse to keep their victims compliant and silent? How many well-meaning but utterly misguided spiritual leaders have used this text to counsel women to stay in violent marriages or employees to endure systemic workplace abuse? The scripture has been twisted into a spiritual muzzle. This theological trauma has convinced countless victims that God requires them to be human punching bags in the name of holiness. The betrayal here is twofold. There is the physical or emotional violation by the abuser, and the spiritual violation by a community that weaponizes the divine to validate the abuse. When a victim is told that bearing the abuse is simply their cross to carry, it fundamentally distorts their view of God. It paints the Creator as a cosmic enabler of domestic violence, narcissism, and spiritual tyranny. We must draw a hard, uncompromising line right here. Biblical forgiveness is not a suicide pact with an abuser. To understand the profound psychological liberation of Christ's command, we must first aggressively define what forgiveness is not. Forgiveness is not reconciliation without repentance. It does not mean the relationship goes back to normal when the other person is still holding a knife behind their back. Forgiveness takes one person, but reconciliation takes two, and God never commands reconciliation with an unrepentant oppressor. Furthermore, turning the cheek is not the erasure of boundaries. It is not an invitation for further abuse, nor is it a mandate to remain in harm's way. The idea that God demands you to stay in proximity to someone who is actively destroying your mental and physical health is a gross distortion of the text. When the church tells a trauma-bonded victim to simply forgive and forget, while the abuse is ongoing, they are essentially telling the victim to stay chemically addicted to their abuser. They are actively reinforcing the learned helplessness that keeps the trauma bond alive. So if turning the cheek isn't about being a passive doormat, what is it? It is the ultimate call to psychological autonomy. True forgiveness, especially in the context of abuse, is the radical decision to take back control of your own nervous system. When you are trauma-bonded, the abuser dictates your reactions. If they attack, you defend, fawn, or panic. You are playing a script that they wrote, reacting exactly how they programmed you to react, which only feeds their need for power and control. To forgive, to mentally and spiritually turn the cheek, is an internal severing of that invisible tether. It is a definitive declaration that the abuser no longer possesses the power to control your emotional state. You are stepping out of the toxic dance entirely. By refusing to retaliate in the bitter manner they expect, and by refusing to submit in the fearful manner they demand, you short-circuit their power over you. You are reclaiming your identity, your boundaries, and the sovereignty of your own mind. True forgiveness is an internal boundary that says, "My peace is no longer contingent on your behavior." It is the moment you stop drinking the poison of their toxicity and expecting them to change. But to truly grasp the genius of this psychological pattern interrupt, we have to travel back 2,000 years to the dusty roads of the Roman Empire. In Part 2, we are going to look at what turning the cheek actually meant in the 1st century, and how this specific, physical action completely shatters the psychological script of an abuser. It is a masterclass in nonviolent defiance that reclaims human dignity. Subscribe so you don't miss it. To heal a brain trapped in an abusive cycle, you have to break the script. Abusers rely entirely on predictability to maintain their power over you. They need you to react to their provocations in one of two specific ways: cowering in fearful submission or lashing out in explosive anger. Both of these predictable reactions serve the abuser's ultimate goal, which is maintaining absolute control over your nervous system. But 2 millennia ago, Jesus of Nazareth delivered a masterclass in psychological disruption. He gave his followers the exact formula for a trauma pattern interrupt, though it has been vastly misunderstood by modern readers. To grasp the sheer brilliance of this intervention, we have to look at the literal historical mechanics of Matthew 5:39. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other also. In the ancient Near East, the right hand was the only hand used for public interaction. The left hand was strictly reserved for unclean tasks and was never, under any circumstances, used to strike another human being. Therefore, if an aggressor is using their right hand to strike your right cheek, the physical geometry only allows for one type of blow. It has to be a backhand. In 1st century Judean culture, a backhanded slap was not designed to cause physical injury or bodily harm. It was a calculated, legally codified insult meant to degrade and humiliate. It was the specific strike used by a master against a slave, a Roman soldier against a Jewish subject, or a superior against an inferior. It was a violent assertion of systemic and personal dominance. By striking you with the back of the hand, the abuser is making a clear, undeniable statement. They are saying, "You are my inferior, you are beneath me, and you do not even possess the dignity of a true opponent." It is an act designed to trigger the very learned helplessness that keeps a trauma bond firmly in place. It demands that you accept your role as the subjugated victim in their narrative. Now, consider the physical reality of turning the other cheek in response to this specific strike. If you turn your head to present your left cheek to the aggressor, you completely alter the spatial dynamic of the confrontation. The aggressor can no longer backhand you with their right hand. To strike your left cheek, they are forced to use an open palm or a closed fist. Culturally and legally in the ancient world, an open-handed slap or a punch was exclusively reserved for fighting an equal. You did not punch a slave, you punched a peer. By turning the cheek, the victim is actively forcing the abuser to acknowledge their equality. It is a physical manifestation of a profound psychological boundary. The action boldly declares, You may have the physical or systemic power to strike me, but you do not have the power to define my worth. I refuse to be humiliated, and if you are going to hit me, you will have to do it as an equal. This is not passive submission, nor is it an invitation for further abuse. It is a profound act of nonviolent defiance that shatters the abuser's framework of reality. This brings us directly back to the psychology of the trauma bond and the concept of the pattern interrupt. When you are caught in an abusive dynamic, your brain is conditioned to expect one of two outcomes. It prepares to either fight back, which justifies the abuser's hostility, or it prepares to fawn and freeze, which validates their dominance. Both of these trauma responses keep the psychological tether perfectly intact. As long as you are fighting or fawning, the abuser is still the one writing the script. You are merely playing the role they assign to you, reacting exactly according to their toxic choreography. Turning the cheek completely bypasses both the fight and the fawn responses. It is a third way, a total disruption of the expected behavioral loop that leaves the abuser entirely disoriented. When you refuse to retaliate, you deny the abuser the justification they are desperately seeking to validate their own cruelty. When you simultaneously refuse to cower, you deny them the dominance and superiority they crave. You step entirely outside the rules of engagement that they have carefully constructed to trap you. You change the rules of the game while they are still trying to play it. This unexpected, dignified response creates massive cognitive dissonance for the aggressor. Their entire power structure relies on your predictable, trauma-driven reaction. When you interrupt that pattern, their psychological leverage instantly evaporates. They are left holding the full, unmitigated weight of their own toxic behavior without your chaotic reaction to use as a convenient smokescreen. By refusing to play your assigned part, you effectively strip the abuser of their perceived power. They can no longer point to your anger to excuse their violence, nor can they point to your fear to prove their superiority. They are exposed. But even more importantly than what this does to the abuser, we must look at what this boundary-driven defiance does to the victim. This act of nonviolent resistance works an absolute miracle inside the victim's traumatized brain. The learned helplessness that characterizes a deep trauma bond finally begins to fracture. You are no longer waiting for the abuser to grant you worth or safety through a sudden, manipulative display of affection. You are independently asserting your own value, regardless of their actions. By claiming your own dignity in the face of their cruelty, you are reclaiming your identity from the ashes of the abuse. You transition from being a passive object of their manipulation to the active agent of your own life. You realize that your inherent worth is not, and never was, up for negotiation. This realization is the very first step in dismantling the invisible cage of a toxic relationship. This is the exact moment the psychological dependency begins to sever. Asserting your equality proves to your own nervous system that you do not need their validation to survive. You also realize that you do not have to fear their invalidation, because their opinion of you is fundamentally irrelevant. The abuser's actions are suddenly isolated, stripped of their ability to dictate your internal emotional reality. You have successfully broken the script, and in doing so, you have initiated the healing process. You have taken the remote control to your nervous system out of their hands. But understanding the historical and psychological genius of this ancient command is only half the battle. We have established the theory of the pattern interrupt, but we must now look at the physiological aftermath. Now that we know exactly what this command means, how does doing it literally change the physical structure of your brain? We're diving into the fascinating science of neuroplasticity in Part 3. They say holding onto anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. But neurologically speaking, harboring a grudge is actually much worse than that. When you obsess over what was done to you and constantly plot your retaliation, you are doing something incredibly dangerous to your own biology. You are willingly handing your abuser the remote control to your central nervous system long after they have left the room. To understand how unforgiveness physically damages the brain, we have to look at a neural system called the default mode network. The default mode network, or DMN, is the interconnected web of brain regions that becomes active when your mind is at rest and left to wander. For a healthy brain, the DMN is responsible for daydreaming, creative problem solving, and reflecting on the future. But for a trauma-bonded brain, the DMN becomes a torture chamber of rumination. When a victim of abuse sits in silence, their DMN inevitably defaults to replaying the trauma, analyzing the abuser's motives, or fantasizing about getting even. This repetitive mental loop is not just harmless daydreaming, it is a highly destructive neurobiological event. Here is the terrifying reality of human neuroscience. Your brain cannot tell the difference between a vividly imagined memory and an event happening in real time. When your default mode network obsessively replays the moment of your abuse, your brain believes you are actively under attack all over again. It immediately commands your adrenal glands to release a fresh wave of cortisol and adrenaline into your bloodstream. You experience the exact same physiological stress response, racing heart, shallow breathing, muscle tension, without the abuser even being present. By refusing to let go of the grudge, you are forcing your body to endure the trauma hundreds of times over. This chronic state of rumination has a profound, measurable impact on the physical structure of your brain. Constant exposure to high levels of cortisol acts like an acid wash on your neural circuitry. Over time, this toxic chemical bath physically enlarges your amygdala, making you hyperreactive, easily triggered, and constantly anxious. Simultaneously, the persistent stress exhausts and shrinks your prefrontal cortex, which is the brain's center for logic, emotional regulation, and impulse control. If you were to look at a thermal brain scan of someone trapped in chronic unforgiveness, their limbic system would be glowing red-hot, overworked, and severely inflamed. This is why plotting retaliation is the ultimate trap for a trauma-bonded victim. It feels incredibly empowering in the moment to fantasize about destroying the person who destroyed you. You might think that clapping back, seeking revenge, or matching their toxic energy will finally balance the scales and bring you peace. But neurologically, fighting back in the exact same style as your abuser guarantees that the trauma bond remains fully intact. You are still allowing their actions to dictate your behavior, keeping you deeply enmeshed in their chaotic emotional web. When you retaliate, you are actively participating in the trauma bond feedback loop. Your abuser thrives on conflict and control, so when you engage in a bitter war of attrition, you are giving them exactly what they want. You are feeding their narrative, validating their hostility, and proving that they still hold immense power over your emotional state. Retaliation does not sever the psychological tether, it reinforces it with a steel cable. To truly break free, you have to initiate a completely different cognitive process, which brings us to the crucial distinction between emotional forgiveness and decisional forgiveness. Modern culture has fundamentally misunderstood forgiveness, reducing it to a warm, fuzzy feeling of goodwill toward an offender. If you wait until you feel like forgiving an abuser, you will be waiting for the rest of your life, because the traumatized brain is hardwired to hold onto anger as a protective shield. Biblical forgiveness is not an emotion. It is a cold, calculated, and highly protective cognitive choice. Decisional forgiveness is the conscious, deliberate act of canceling the debt of retaliation. It is looking at the staggering moral and emotional debt the abuser owes you and choosing to stamp it void. Canceling this debt does not mean the abuser's actions were acceptable, nor does it mean they are suddenly exempt from legal or earthly consequences. It simply means that you are permanently resigning from the exhausting job of being their judge, jury, and executioner. You are making a definitive, executive decision in your prefrontal cortex to stop pouring your vital cognitive energy into their ledger. This decisional forgiveness is the vital prerequisite for the brain to begin physically healing itself. The moment you make this choice, you activate the incredible biological phenomenon of neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is the brain's remarkable ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections throughout life. In neuroscience, there is a foundational rule known as Hebb's law, which states, neurons that fire together, wire together. Every time you engage in rumination, anger, or trauma-bonded fawning, you are firing a specific sequence of neurons. Over time, these frequently used neural pathways become massive, multi-lane biological highways, making it incredibly easy and automatic for your brain to slip into anxiety or bitterness. The trauma response becomes your brain's path of least resistance. However, the inverse of Hebb's law is equally true. Neurons that fail to sync lose their link. When you make the radical choice to forgive, when you definitively choose not to retaliate and not to ruminate, you stop sending electrical traffic down those toxic neurological highways. By mentally turning the other cheek, you are actively starving the old, trauma-bonded pathways of the energy they need to survive. Without that constant electrical reinforcement, those destructive neural connections literally begin to wither and prune themselves away. This is the hidden, physiological miracle of Christ's command to forgive your enemies. It is a divine blueprint for targeted neuroplasticity. By consciously choosing a new, non-retaliatory response, you are forcing your brain to carve out entirely new neural pathways. You are building fresh, healthy bridges in your mind that bypass the abuser entirely. The more you practice this decisional forgiveness, the stronger these new pathways become, eventually replacing the old trauma responses as your brain's new default setting. As these new neural networks solidify, the physical architecture of your brain begins to heal. Without the constant rumination driving your default mode network, your cortisol levels finally begin to plummet. Your enlarged amygdala starts to shrink back to its normal, healthy size, turning off the relentless internal alarm sirens. Meanwhile, your prefrontal cortex begins to recover its mass and density, restoring your ability to think clearly, regulate your emotions, and experience genuine joy. Forgiveness literally rewires your brain from a state of survival back to a state of peace. The command to turn the other cheek is not a mandate to ignore your pain. It is the ultimate strategy for neurological liberation. It is the exact mechanism required to flush the poison of resentment out of your nervous system before it destroys you. By choosing forgiveness, you are taking the remote control of your mind back from the person who hurt you, locking them out of your biology for good. You are no longer a hostage to your own memories. We now understand the profound neuroscience behind this command, and we know that forgiveness is the key to unlocking neuroplasticity. But knowing the theory and executing it are two entirely different things. When your body is flooded with panic and your mind is screaming for justice, how do you actually force your brain to make this choice? In our final episode, I am going to give you the highly practical, step-by-step psychological framework to rewire your brain through radical forgiveness. Healing from a trauma bond does not happen by accident, and it certainly does not happen overnight. It requires a deliberate, conscious rewiring of your brain's most entrenched survival mechanisms. Today, we are moving out of the theoretical realm and into your daily life, putting both the theology and the neuroscience into practice. This is the actionable, step-by-step psychological framework designed to finalize the healing of a trauma-bonded brain. We are going to walk through the exact process of radical forgiveness. The very first step in this process is recognizing a fundamental biological truth. You cannot forgive from a dysregulated state. When your nervous system is trapped in fight or flight, your prefrontal cortex is essentially offline. You cannot make the high-level cognitive choice to cancel a debt when your amygdala is screaming that you are about to be attacked. Therefore, before you can even attempt to forgive, you must physically ground your body and regulate your nervous system. You have to convince your biology that the immediate threat has passed. This is where targeted physiological interventions like vagus nerve stimulation, deep diaphragmatic breathwork, and focused meditation become absolutely critical. By intentionally slowing your breathing and lowering your heart rate, you send a biological safety signal directly to your brainstem. This physical calming process forces blood flow away from the reactive limbic system and back into the logical prefrontal cortex. Once the executive center of your brain is back online, you regain the capacity for complex decision-making and emotional regulation. Long before modern psychology mapped the nervous system, ancient scripture provided this exact neurological imperative. When the psalmist writes, "Be still and know that I am God," it is not merely a poetic suggestion for a quiet morning. It is a biological directive to halt the frantic, trauma-driven hypervigilance of your body. You must command your nervous system to be still before your mind can possess the clarity to know and execute the profound act of forgiveness. Once your body is anchored in a state of physical safety, you can move to the second step, radical acceptance and acknowledging the debt. You cannot cancel a debt if you refuse to look honestly at the ledger. Victims of trauma bonding often minimize their abuse or make excuses for their abuser to avoid facing the crushing reality of what was done to them. But true forgiveness requires ruthless, uncompromising honesty about the damage inflicted. You must shatter the cognitive dissonance that the abuser relied upon. You must explicitly name exactly what the abuser stole from you, whether it was your time, your finances, your innocence, or your sense of self-worth. Write it down, speak it aloud, and grieve the loss without sugarcoating the cruelty of their actions. This is not about wallowing in pain. It is about establishing a firm, objective reality that destroys the abuser's gaslighting. Only when you have fully quantified the profound injustice of the debt can you exercise the sovereign power to stamp it void. This leads directly into cognitive reframing, where you actively reclaim your personal narrative from the ashes of the abuse. You must consciously shift your internal identity from being the passive victim of their cruelty to the active agent of your own grace. Remember, turning the cheek is an empowered, boundary-setting choice that you make entirely on your own terms. By choosing to forgive, you are declaring that you are no longer defined by what was done to you, but by how you powerfully choose to respond. The third and most difficult step in rewiring your brain is the actual mechanism of forgiveness, releasing the right to retaliate. This is the moment you officially hand the scales of justice over to a higher authority, permanently resigning from your role as judge and executioner. In the Christian tradition, this is embodied in the command of Romans 12:19. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. This is not about passively letting an abuser get away with their crimes without consequence. Rather, it is about recognizing that orchestrating another human being's cosmic punishment is a burden your nervous system was never designed to carry. When you obsess over ensuring your abuser gets their karma, you remain hypervigilant, scanning the horizon for proof that they are suffering. This keeps your brain locked in a state of chronic stress and prevents any real psychological healing. Handing over the scales of justice relieves your brain of this exhausting, impossible responsibility. You are trusting a perfect judge to handle the ledger so you can finally walk away. The neurological payoff for this surrender is absolutely staggering. When you definitively release the need to orchestrate their punishment, your brain registers a massive, immediate drop in cognitive load. Your baseline anxiety plummets, your blood pressure stabilizes, and the physical architecture of your overworked amygdala finally begins to shrink. The trauma bond dissolves completely because the abuser is no longer the focal point of your survival, your identity, or your sense of justice. As we look back over this journey, the profound genius of the Christian command to forgive becomes undeniably clear. We started by examining the invisible, neurochemical chains of the trauma bond, understanding how intermittent reinforcement holds the human brain hostage. We then unpacked the historical brilliance of turning the other cheek, revealing it not as a mandate for submission, but as a masterful pattern interrupt. It is a physical and psychological boundary that strips the abuser of their power and reclaims your inherent dignity. From there, we explored the terrifying biological consequences of rumination and the hidden dangers of holding a grudge. We saw how harboring resentment keeps the default mode network trapped in the past, flooding the body with cortisol and literally burning out the brain's executive functioning. But we also discovered the miraculous promise of targeted neuroplasticity. By choosing decisional forgiveness, you actively starve the old, toxic pathways and build new, healthy bridges to lasting peace. Ultimately, we must permanently discard the toxic theology that demands victims remain in harm's way in the name of submission. The command to forgive was never given to benefit the person who broke you, nor was it designed to excuse their monstrous behavior. It was given by a creator who intimately understands the biology of the human mind and who desires your absolute liberation. Forgiveness is the psychological key designed to unlock your prison door and set you completely free. If you or someone you love has been trapped in a trauma bond, weighed down by religious trauma, or suffocated by resentment, please share this entire playlist with them. Leave a comment below about your own healing journey, as your story might be exactly what someone else needs to read today to start rewiring their own mind. Finally, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue dismantling toxic misconceptions and exploring the profound intersection of psychology, neuroscience, and faith together.